In March 1943, British planes took off for the German industrial city of Essen. High-speed Mosquito light bombers went in first, dropping flares to highlight the targets. Then a force of nearly 450 Lancaster bombers swept over the city, dropping their loads. The German defences were overpowered. Only 14 British aircraft were shot down. The Essen raid was followed by wave after wave of similar attacks on industrial towns in the Ruhr. But the German air defences now began to get the measure of the Allied attacks. Britain's losses climbed to 1 in 10. Harris was forced reluctantly to call a halt to the attacks. But then he was informed about a new Allied invention. Codenamed Window, it consisted of clouds of aluminium foil strips dropped from an aircraft. As the foil fell, it jammed any radar system. It promised to cripple the German air defences. Harris seized on it. And 4 months after the Essen raid, in July 1943, he went back on the offensive. He called it Operation Gomorrah. The target this time was the industrial port of Hamburg. Bombers equipped with Window jammed the German radar. Other aircraft dropped incendiary bombs. A giant firestorm engulfed the city centre. "40,000 people died, and 500,000 were made homeless. More raids on the port followed. It was an enormous shock to the German people. Four months later, in the autumn of 1943, Harris followed Hamburg with a series of attacks on Berlin. But by now the Germans were learning to overcome the effect of Window, and by spring 1944, British losses were back at nearly 1 plane in 10. Worse, there was no sign German civilian morale was cracking. Harris's carpet bombing campaign was just not working. But neither was the American alternative of targeting infrastructure. By the spring of 1943, US Army Air Force daylight raids were steadily reaching deeper into Germany. But American losses were climbing. Around 1 in every 15 planes was being shot down. Yet undaunted, the American command now launched an attack on factories in the German towns of Regensburg and Schweinfurt. It was hugely ambitious. Both were deep in southern Germany, far beyond the range of US escort fighters. It was a disaster. The 380 flying fortresses, which US bomber chiefs had assured everybody wouldn't need a fighter escort, were harried and shot down. The loss rate was over 16%. The US was forced to suspend its bombing campaign. The war in the air had reached stalemate, and there was still no sign of it helping to usher in a victory. Then, in the early summer of 1944, as the Allies prepared to invade mainland Europe, the British and American air forces were tasked with disrupting German communication lines and oil supplies. It represented a return to targeted infrastructure bombing. But this time, the Allies had a new weapon. The British had experimentally modified a US fighter, the P-51 Mustang. The US engine had been replaced by a British-made Rolls-Royce Merlin. It gave the plane a much longer range. It was the ideal long-distance bomber escort. The Allied bombers hit bridges and roads leading to the German front in France with almost surgical precision. Oil supplies to the German military were drastically reduced. Once again, the German fighters attacked, but they were now outmaneuvered by the Mustang. Much of the German Air Force, now running low on fuel, was grounded. The campaign of targeted bombing on Germany's infrastructure may not have been the knockout blow the Allies hoped for, but it was finally paying dividends. But one man was not impressed. Bomber Harris was still obsessed with the idea that ever more devastating carpet bombing attacks would stop Germany in her tracks once and for all. So it was that in late 1944, Britain returned to carpet bombing. German city after city was hit and devastated. Then, in February 1945, Harris attacked Dresden, a city with virtually no military significance. The city's civilian population had been inflated by refugees fleeing bombing raids elsewhere. Yet Harris seems to have had no regard for civilian life. The city was flattened. Some 50,000 people died. It was a raid too far. Finally, questions began to be asked about the morality, let alone the efficacy, of carpet bombing. Whatever it had achieved, it had been done at an horrendous cost of civilian and military lives. Critically, it had failed to break German morale, yet 60% of RAF crews had died before they had completed 30 missions. For all the hopes put in it, carpet bombing had not come up with the knockout blow. The Germans, meanwhile, had put their faith in an altogether different technology to give them the knockout blow they needed to win the war.